broadcast of these proceedings. Today, the committee will take evidence from Treasury and the Australian Taxation Office. In the submission, the Tax Office states that it supports external scrutiny, provided it is effective and fit for purpose. It recommends that its external scrutiny should be streamlined and there should be clear boundaries between the scrutineers, and scrutineers should be subject matter experts where appropriate, and they take a risk-based approach. The Tax Office also suggests that given the positive feedback it receives overall, it's time to streamline its scrutiny arrangements. I look forward to discussing these points today, and I welcome representatives from Treasury and the Australian Taxation Office. Although the committee does not require you to give evidence under oath, I advise you that these hearings are formal proceedings of the Parliament and warrant the same respect as proceedings of the respective houses. The giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as contempt of Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. For the Hansard record, could you please state your name and the capacity in which you appear before the committee?
Jeff Leaper, Acting Commissioner of Taxation.
Andrew Mills, Second Commissioner of Taxation.
Rob Heffron, Deputy Secretary Revenue Group from the Treasury.
Jackie Curtis, Chief Operating Officer, Acting ATO.
Thanks, everybody. Do you have an opening statement you wish to make to the committee?
If I may, Chair. Thank you, yes.
Thank you, Mr. Leaper.
With apologies for Commissioner Jordan's absence, he has had a short period of leave planned before this inquiry was announced, so with apologies. The Commissioner does have very clear views on this topic. I can assure you he was closely involved in the preparation of the ATO submission, and he would of course be happy to offer further commentary if required at what we understand is a planned subsequent hearing. The Commissioner has, since he started in 2013, opened up the ATO to feedback from taxpayers and stakeholders, to be a client-focused organisation that is tuned in to the needs and connected with the community. He's implemented independent review, improved our consultation arrangements and established the reinvention program with ongoing co-design and input from different segments of the community. It's fair to say that under Commissioner Jordan's leadership and in the past 3 years, the ATO's culture has shifted in a positive way, as is our preparedness to be open and willing to change. Key points we would like to make: scrutiny is important for public administration and should enable government to show that it's both responsive and responsible to the community that it serves. Scrutiny of the ATO should, in our view, ultimately result in a more effective and efficient tax and superannuation administration for Australia. It is good to question the value from existing arrangements. Is government, is the community and our taxpayers getting value for money from the way scrutiny is being performed at the present? Is there a good return on investment? Not only do we have the cost of scrutineering activity, there's a cost of ATO resources diverted from core business to support both the review process and the implementation of recommendations. We have had mixed experience of scrutiny, some very useful, insightful, constructive and strategic, some that is repetitive and really just recommending what we are doing already. The ATO is a big operation, and for the nature, scale, complexity and volume of our throughput, we have relatively low numbers of complaints and disputes. In 2014-15, with over 35 million activity statements and income tax returns lodged, and over 23 million inbound service interactions over phone, voice response units, online and letters, there were just over 29,000 formal complaint issues in that financial year, less than 0.1% of lodgements. Some complaints reflect systemic issues and need to be addressed quickly, and we have arrangements in place to do that. Others reflect service expectations. For example, as we've told this committee, it's now possible for someone with simple tax affairs to do their tax return in about 10 minutes. They don't quite understand why our back-end models take a number of days then to process that return. So we do see some complaints about the speed of refunds. Other complaints, we're less clear about their origin. We had, in the period July 14 to September 15, about 10,500 complaints from the tax agent population, but 10 of those tax agents actually accounted for 8% of all those complaints. And one tax agent actually complained on over 200 occasions of matters dealing with the ATO. This is not to say that we trivialise complaints or disputes, but getting the low proportion of complaints in perspective to overall service volumes is important in considering the investment in and the foregone cost of scrutiny and intervention. I note with concern the reported comments by the head of the Independent Contractors Association today criticising the ATO for purportedly making improper allegations of fraud against small business. Mr Phillips has made these claims on numerous occasions and in various forums, but despite our invitation, has not brought any actual cases forward for investigation. I'll repeat that offer now. If the ICA wishes to provide the ATO with actual cases to support Mr Phillips' claims, we will have these cases independently reviewed and we will report back to this committee on a de-identified basis on the outcomes. If there are no such cases, we respectfully suggest Mr Phillips ought withdraw these claims that go to the integrity of the ATO in administering the tax and superannuation systems. We suggest that scrutiny of the ATO ought to be conducted in such a way that is constructive, future-focused and facilitates big step improvement. To drive better value from scrutiny, we suggest the following principles could be considered by the committee. Effective scrutiny ought to reduce red tape and unnecessary bureaucracy, provide clarity of roles and boundaries for the respective scrutinees, provide support for the direct relationship between the ATO and its clients rather than third-party intervention, support whole-of-government performance rather than agency-specific review, for example in the MyGov space, use subject matter experts, as you've noted, Chair, to advise on specific areas of operations, use a risk-based approach with concepts such as earned autonomy and differential regulation, and strengthen corporate governance in the ATO with external input and validation from the community. So we would suggest that an effective scrutiny framework could consist of the following key elements. Parliamentary oversight in the form of existing parliamentary committee, that is Senate estimates, this committee and special purpose inquiries such as the recent inquiry into corporate tax avoidance. The Australian National Audit Office for financial statements and performance matters, noting in particular that the ANO tends to focus on whole of government in the performance review area. And with those two key areas occurring against the existing background of internal ATO scrutiny, including a complaints mechanism for taxpayers that includes external escalation where matters are not resolved to the satisfaction of the taxpayer, direct feedback sourced from taxpayers about their current and desired future experience to improve client engagement, contracted subject matter experts on specific functions and areas of operations, and periodic whole of organisation review, such as we had in 2013 with the capability review and 2015 with the functional and efficiency review, consultation arrangements with key stakeholders and segments of the community, and of course, as with every organisation, the ATO's Audit and Risk Committee, which I know does include external membership. We're happy to respond to any questions that you have. Thank you for the chance to make the opening statement.
Thank you, Mr Leeper. Mr Hepburn, have you got an opening statement you wish to make?
Thank you, Chair. We haven't provided a submission. I don't have a very long opening statement. Just to put on the record that we have the opportunity to discuss the submission that the ATO has made and also the opening statement, and we concur completely with all the propositions in those both those the documents, and in particular the as outlined by Mr Leeper, the characteristics of an effective scrutiny framework we think are particularly on point and would support them wholeheartedly. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Hepburn. And, maybe I'll hand to you first, Rowan, given that you've got some time constraints.
Yeah, well, perhaps the only thing I'll say is that the Tax Office is the most intrusive agency in the entire government. It affects everybody's life and it drives their behaviour. And so it is not surprising that it is subject to pretty heavy scrutiny. Everybody has an opinion about you, whether it's good, bad or indifferent. Everyone has an opinion. And rightly or wrongly, they don't blame the government for the collection of the taxes, they blame you. And if they can get a deduction that comes off their tax return, they think that's a good thing. And most of them, I think, dare I say it, would have cheered at Kerry Prackett's testimony all those years ago. So I don't think it's surprising that you are subject to more scrutiny than anybody else. And quite frankly, I don't think it's up to you to tell the Parliament how much scrutiny our committees will give to the Tax Office. That's a matter for the Parliament. And I have been one who has been critical in the past with regard to the making of rulings, public rulings, that in fact you very often usurp the function of the Parliament and you make law as distinct from interpreting the law as it is. I still hold that view. I've long wanted to make rulings instruments that are subject to tabling and disallowance, but I've not been successful in persuading others to that point of view, but that is my point of view. Now, against that, I find that in issues where I've got concerns about things, I find I get good cooperation from the Tax Office, and I'd like to acknowledge that because I think it's very helpful to you, and it's certainly helpful to members of the public who might come to me. So I hear what you say, but I think the Parliament will decide, and the committees of the Parliament will decide whether or not they have inquiries. I don't think there is any agency that would dare otherwise come in here and say, we'll dictate who shall be allowed to inquire into our affairs. I don't think that would be reasonable. So,
I don't think that was part of our evidence, Mrs Bishop. I mean, what we've really said is we accept completely parliamentary scrutiny. What we've consciously tried to do in our submission is not offer specific courses of action, but offer what we thought were principles and guidance around what would constitute, in our view, effective scrutiny. We do expect to be scrutinised, and we hope to withstand that scrutiny, and if not, we have actions to do. We will change things, but we certainly, I would not have thought our submission or my opening comments was us telling the Parliament how it ought to conduct itself. That
did my
would be
hearing
improper.
deceive me when I heard you saying which committees you thought should be the ones doing the investigating or the scrutiny?
They were examples of the kinds of scrutiny that Parliament applies, Mrs Bishop.
Could you just reread it to me, what you said? I thought you said these should be the committees.
I said, for example, and including the estimates committees, this committee, and special purpose
I didn't
inquiries.
hear the word including.
Oh, I thought it was inferred, but
No, it wasn't.
we're not trying to tell you how to organise, obviously. But
Well, I'm very pleased about that,
that's
because
our current
it wouldn't go down
experience.
terribly well.
That's our current experience of scrutiny, and I think we're just saying we find that completely appropriate. The parliamentary
I am one who
scrutiny
sat
is-
on a committee in 1991, which resulted in certainly the Inspector General of Taxation being appointed and a charter for taxpayers being made. And I notice that in your proposed scrutiny framework, the Inspector General doesn't even get a mention.
We've talked about two specific forms of scrutiny, parliamentary scrutiny and scrutiny by the ANAO. We haven't made a specific comment or recommendation in that area because we think, as you've commented, it would be probably presumptuous to say, well, we like this but we don't like that. We're just trying to talk about the kinds of principles of scrutiny and what we're trying to get out of it collectively.
Well, perhaps I've had my say, but that's not the way it came across.
Sorry, Chair, if I could, in indicating our support for, and obviously as the committee knows, the precise institutional arrangements obviously a matter for the government to put to the Parliament and the Parliament to agree or otherwise. But in his role as the principal tax policy advisor of the government, in Mr Leibner's opening comments, where he talked about the parliamentary oversight, referred to the Estimates Committee, this committee and other special purpose inquiries, which of course is, from our point of view, would be open-ended. And obviously it's within the expectation, if an issue came up that needed examination, fully expect the Parliament would want to form a committee, either the House or the Senate or some sort of joint to examine that. So wouldn't like to think we were in any way supporting an idea that the current set of committees ought to be the full and necessary set. I mean, obviously in the future there may well need to be separate committees set up, but that was, I just want to make that clear. There was an implication that the supporting the idea of the existing structure being that which should exist.
I thank you for that, but I'll take you to the external governance chart that you provided in your submission, and it looks busy. However, I have some concerns around the fact that all of the arrows only point one way, and I would suggest that in relation to parliamentary inquiries in particular, I'm assuming the circle's that big because that's the list of ones that you're currently providing information to or have provided submissions to and are involved in some way. I would suggest that arrow actually flows the other way. You know, it's or at least it's a two-way arrow. It's not solely one way to yourselves. Equally with the Audit Office and the Inspector General of Taxation, because my understanding is that you all actually work together, and the ANAO in particular with their work program, my understanding is that they do advise you of their upcoming work program, so you are aware of that, that's upcoming. So therefore, really it's a two-way arrow, not a single arrow aimed at yourselves. My understanding with the Inspector General of Taxation, that's the same. Obviously, the Commonwealth Ombudsman now, with the tax complaints function transferred to the Inspector General of Taxation, I'd be interested to know what, if any, interaction now you have with the Commonwealth Ombudsman, and more broadly, how does the level of scrutiny, but more importantly the interaction with various parts of government, how does it compare to other departments? And my reading of the requirements of other departments within the government is that it's not actually that much different from your responsibilities and your external governance requirements.
Okay, if I may. So the diagram wasn't intended to make us look like we think we're the centre of the universe. We were intending to show the various sources of reporting and conformance obligations, external scrutiny, parliamentary scrutiny, that potentially at one point in time impact on the tax office. This is our current picture of what's on foot, and you're quite correct, Chair. The reason why the left-hand bottom bubble is so big, because at the moment there are quite a number of inquiries that we've been invited to provide input into. To go to your second point, every agency of government would have the reporting and conformance obligations in the top left-hand corner: external conformance, corporate plans, agencies which are regulated, of which the tax office is an example, and we have adopted the regulatory performance framework. So those things are probably common to any agency with regulatory impact. We do still have some relationship with Commonwealth Ombudsman beyond tax complaints, including the Ombudsman can make own motion investigations. You've talked about parliamentary inquiries. Those are the ones which at the present time are specific to us. We, like other agencies, appear before estimates, and there are many standing committees of either the House or the Senate, or joint committees which would variously in different portfolios impact on different agencies. Our experience here is that this committee is part of our external governance framework. The one that stands out, I guess, is the Inspector General, because I'm not aware of too many other cases, perhaps the Inspector General of Security, where there are either agency or activity-specific additional pieces of external scrutiny. If my colleagues want to correct me, I'm happy to be corrected, but I think ourselves and the Inspector General of Security roles would probably be the two standout ones there, which would be different from the experience of most other departments and major agencies.
So really you're saying that the only additional piece of scrutiny you have compared to any other government department is the Inspector General of Taxation, and predominantly their role, whilst it's been an advice and administrative review role previously, it now has the complaints process as well, which was previously with the Ombudsman. So probably to enlighten me somewhat, and those that are listening, other than the Inspector General of Taxation, which I think is a valuable role to ensure complaints are handled adequately and appropriately, and it's my understanding that from the level of complaints that the IGT is receiving, a lot of those are now filtered by them and don't even come back to the ATO. They're dealt with and sorted out before they even become a major issue. And I don't have the figures presently with me. But that appears to be the only extra layer of scrutiny that you're receiving over and above what everybody else is receiving. Therefore, and given the importance of your role in the Australian community, I'm a bit puzzled as to what the issue actually is.
If I may then, to go to your first point, when the complaints function moved from the Ombudsman to the Inspector General last May, the experience when it was with the Ombudsman would have been exactly the same. That is, a person would make a complaint and the Ombudsman would decide whether or not to close the matter without further investigation, or whether they would actually ask the agency to investigate and provide a report. So that experience probably hasn't changed. I would note the numbers of complaints that being received by the Inspector General are higher than we had seen with the Ombudsman. That would be my first point. The second point, I think, though, is probably material, and that is that I'm not aware that the ANAO varies its planned audit activity on the tax office with regard to the program that's established by the Inspector General. I'm not aware that they coordinate their programs of activity. I'm happy to take on and check that on notice, but I think they are actually independently worked up, as it were.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll just...
If I may add, Chair, even if that is coordinated, it's perhaps not the number of different scrutineers that's perhaps the focus of our submission. It's the extent to which they are appropriately structured, focused on strategic issues, and avoid overlap and repetition. So we do have examples of where there have been multiple reviews effectively on the same topic over a 10+ year period. And I guess the point is we're not sure whether that is in fact adding value when different scrutineers may cover the same ground at different times over an extended period. So it's not so much the number of different scrutineers or even the actual bodies that exist. It's can the scrutiny be coordinated, be forward-focused, be strategic, and add value for the community?
Well, I'll bring your attention to some comments from a previous parliamentary committee, and this was from the Joint Committee of Public Accounts and Audit in 2011. And the committee recommended that external review agencies investigate and report on opportunities for more strategic planning and improved information sharing as they undertake their reviews to avoid duplication of their efforts and the Australian Taxation Office's resources. So could you please update the committee on your experience in that regard as to whether those external agencies are doing that work to ensure that their work programs don't overlap each other, so as there is that reduction in workload, but on the same basis, ensuring that the issues do arise are properly dealt with.
Yeah, Chair, if I may, I won't speak to that issue. One of the terms of reference of this committee obviously is around removing inefficiency and duplication. I think it goes to the point that my colleague Mr Mills made, is that we're not actually here proposing that we should have less scrutiny, but one of the things that we are concerned about in particular is around inefficiency and duplication, which goes to the question you've just asked. So to give you an example of where we're finding that there is a lot of duplication in the system around scrutiny, if we take an example of employer obligations compliance activities, which is one of the areas that has been reviewed in the organisation, we can actually see that over a period of 5 or 6 years, we've had 6 scrutiny reviews into the same issue, and often they have not only duplicated, but they have come in and reviewed and made recommendations that are actually duplicate other recommendations that have been made and agreed upon. So there are examples.
They've never been followed up and acted upon. And dare I say, one of those you just mentioned would go right to the heart of requiring a reporting on the gap between the income tax that should be in fact received and that you in fact do collect. How many years have we been asking for that? How many more inquiries would it require in order to get an answer?
Well, Ms Bishop, I can't comment on whether or not...
Well, I can. I'm looking at your list here. I see in the list of 17 that you're objecting to, I presume, 3 of them, I presume, are Senate inquiries looking at specific bills relating to tax. Oh, we shouldn't have people looking at that, should we?
Ms
I'm
Bishop,
sorry.
I'm not referring to Senate committees. I'm talking specifically here about ANAO reviews and reviews by the Inspector General, where we have seen duplication in the actual issues being reviewed and indeed in some of the recommendations. And my understanding is that we actually have to report on the progress we've made on those recommendations, which also in our submission you'll see the recommendations made particularly by the Inspector General of Taxation far exceed recommendations made by organisations like the ANAO or parliamentary committees, and that in some cases these recommendations we're finding do not add significant value to the experience of the client, which is where our complete focus is within the tax office and is part of the new approach that we're trying to progress with reinventing the ATO, which is trying to shift the client experience. And what this is doing is actually taking resources away from the mainstream outcomes of the organisation, which is actually about making it easier for people to do their tax affairs.
So if you're made aware, or when you were made aware of a particular line of inquiry from a scrutiny agency, say it's the Inspector General of Taxation or the ANAO, and you are aware that there was an inquiry into that particular topic done previously, are you advising or seeking to meet with that scrutiny agency to say, listen, this inquiry was done 2 years ago, 3 years ago, here's the set of recommendations, these are the actions we have taken as a result of that. Is this piece of work really required, and what is the basis for that piece of work being undertaken if we are already taking actions on the previous recommendations?
So the area that the review is focused at, the people within the organisation that run that area would liaise directly with the scrutineers, and also through, we have 4 people that work in this area to coordinate the reviews, and they would work directly with the scrutineering organisation, whether it be the ANAO or the IGOT, and they would actually be briefing them from the very beginning about what our view is about the review that's being undertaken and previous reviews, as well as previous recommendations and the progress that has been made against those. So we certainly do try to get involved from the very beginning and put forward our view, but that doesn't necessarily get reflected in the scope of the review or how the review is undertaken.
So would it be fair to say then that potentially the reason that those review agencies proceed with their review is that their opinion is that progress on previous recommendations is non-existent, lacking, or not progressing far enough or in enough detail to see that those recommendations are going to be satisfied if those recommendations have been accepted in the first place?
I'm not sure, Chair, if that's entirely fair. Each of these reviews, when it produces recommendations where we agree with the recommendation, it goes into a process where we report on progress both at a management level and also to our audit committee. The ANAO certainly attends our audit committee at each meeting. We do engage with both the ANAO and the Inspector General where we're consulted on proposed topics for review, and we can put a proposition. We can say, look, the area you're proposing to look at is undergoing significant change. If you want to do the scrutiny, we think it's a good idea, but maybe 6 or 12 months might be better. But at the end of the day, it's their call because each of them has statutory independent powers to make those decisions. Could I please just clarify, it's very important that this be understood. This map we've drawn is not us criticising anything. This is factual. This is what our experience is at the moment. So, Mrs Bishop, we are not criticising that there are 17 inquiries. We're just recording for the committee's information. But that's what we're currently...
I don't accept that.
We're not criticising...
You've put it in here saying, basically saying, look at all the time, our valuable time you're taking up. And you use the word, very sneakily I think, the ATO is currently involved in 17 parliamentary inquiries. That means you've been called to give evidence, I take it, with regard to some of them, such as, for instance.
the economic security for women in retirement. Now, that's not an inquiry into the tax office, that's an inquiry into something very important. But you're involved in it. What is the extent of your involvement in that inquiry?
On all of these inquiries...
What is the extent of your involvement in that inquiry?
As I understand it, Mrs Bishop, we're invited to make submission to the inquiry, and from time to time we may be invited to appear in front of a committee hearing.
Have you given a submission on that inquiry?
I personally don't know, but we can
How
take
many
that on
pages
notice.
is it, and how many times have you been invited to come and give evidence?
I don't have the information with me.
Well, you've put it down here as a criticism.
It's not a criticism.
Well, I'm sorry, that's the way I see it. And listening particularly to Ms Curtis, I find that also criticism. So I'd be very interested to know about the 17 you've listed, which ones you consider as taking up the most of your valuable time, and you shouldn't be asked to be involved. But if you could tell me about each one of those, what is the degree of your involvement?
I want to make this extremely clear. We have not said in our submission, I have not said in my talking points in any way that we've criticised any form of parliamentary scrutiny. It would be quite inappropriate for any agency of state to take that position.
Quite so.
So this chart is our factual recording of our current interactions with the various parts of our external governance
And if it's
framework.
to be factual, I want to know factually what is your involvement, the word you've chosen to use, in each of those inquiries.
And we will provide that. But please, it is not a criticism, and we would never, for
That
a
is
moment...
the Parliament doing its work.
Absolutely. We would never for a moment suggest the way in which the Parliament would do its work. It's Parliament's prerogative and decision. We haven't suggested that.
Good afternoon, Andrew Hastie, Member for Canning from Western Australia. If we could transition to your internal governance model, and I refer to paragraph 48 from your submission, which states the ATO has established a multifaceted and robust framework of governance and oversight which ensures we are transparent and accountable for our decision-making and performance. And if you flick over to Appendix 3, which shows, I think, a conceptual, I'd say it's more conceptual than anything, model of your internal governance framework. If you could explain how this works in a little more detail to help us understand it, that would be appreciated.
Certainly. I'll do my best, and my colleagues might assist if I'm not doing as well as I might. This is a diagram that just tries to show the kinds of influences and the kinds of structures that we use to make sure that we can give confidence to both the executive management of the agency, but also then to external bodies and to agencies and other important stakeholders, and including in there the Parliament, how our performance is running, and those are things that you would generally find in the performance and evaluation area are common to most public service agencies. I did make the comment about the regulator performance framework. Self-assessment is unique to regulators such as ourselves. We have some accountability and conformance. Those areas are designed to make sure that we comply with things such as the Public Service Act, the Public Governance Performance and Accountability Act. Again, they are things which are common to most agencies of state. So there are things in there which are important to give the executive committee of the agency confidence that the place is governing itself and operating correctly. The systems and structures are basically how we organise ourselves to both keep a track of the current business and also to improve. So, for example, the Organisation Realignment Program in the bottom left-hand area, corporate function reviews, plan and manage reviews are things that we've done voluntarily to improve the performance of the organisation and to make sure that resources are directed in the most appropriate areas. And perhaps I should have started with strategy and direction, but those are the documents where we report both to stakeholders but also to the Parliament through things like portfolio budget statements and corporate plans about our strategy and intention to deliver against the objectives which are set out in our budget statements as well. There's quite a lot there.
There is, and the reason I ask, coming from a defence background myself, I've seen a lot of these, and what I always ask for afterwards is an organisational chart, because that best demonstrates the flow of information and who has oversight. And I'm not sure if I missed that, but that would be handy.
But effectively, in my substantive capacity, I'm responsible for, with Ms Curtis, corporate functions, service delivery and technology functions, including debt. Mr Olsen, who's not here today, is responsible for client engagement, which was the new name for our compliance functions, and Mr Mills is responsible for our law, design and practice area. So there's a professional stream, a client engagement stream, and the operational, technology and corporate functions of the organisation, and that's how we organise it at a second commissioner level.
Okay.
But we will provide the organisation structure and notice.
Yep. Thank you.
All right, now I've just gone to your actual submission. Page 32. The ATO has been subject to much scrutiny in the past 5 years. 51 audits, reviews and investigations with more than 630 pages of reports and 366 recommendations. Of the reports, 53 were from the ANAO. That's their job. And you haven't told me if they're all performance audits. Presumably they are. Or a large percentage will be.
There may be some from financial statements, yes.
But would be, in the interest of facts, it would be very good to know. 43% were from the Inspector General and 4% were from the Ombudsman. But you don't want the Inspector General to be part of the ongoing scrutiny. The government has initiated reviews in the past few years, including APS Contestability Program, Functional and Efficiency Review of the ATO, I don't know who's conducting those, Towards Responsible Government, National Commission of Audit. That was a huge policy of government to have a National Commission of Audit, and you're critical of it. No. The Australian Public Service Commissioner's Capability Review of the ATO, external expert reviews including, and 3 more listed. Then you go on to say, the current, direct and foregone costs of the ATO in responding and assisting scrutiny are high and at times have questionable returns on investment for taxpayers, the community and government. It is appropriate to question the value and cost to government of the present array of scrutiny. This is particularly relevant at a time of diminishing funding to the APS functions. Really? The Parliament will do its duty, the Parliament will make its decision and the government will make its decision as to what scrutiny is required.
Absolutely.
And
there's nothing that we said in the submission that suggests otherwise.
Well, you and I must have a different reading.
Well,
I find that
we've
highly
tried to be as
offensive.
factual as possible
Given
in
the
the
positive
submission,
feedback
Mrs.
the ATO receives overall, it is time to streamline its scrutiny arrangements. In other words, less.
No, not less at all.
Excuse me, Chair. I mean, the terms of reference to the committee were pretty clear. Certainly in working with the Tax Office to have a look at the submission, I mean, I think it's incumbent upon the Tax Office to put on the record what scrutiny it is subject to. And as far as I can see, there's no value judgment whether the scrutiny is... and there's nothing to say it's inappropriate or excessive. I think it's just stating these are what the facts are.
Your precise words, a questionable return for investment of taxpayers, the community and government. If that's not critical, I don't know what is.
Oh, I think in sum total they could be saying that's critical.
No, in specifics.
No.
Oh, I think that's talking about the total of the reports taken
You've
together.
had 51 reports, half of which are from the Australian Audit Office. And you don't like that either.
Yes, but...
sorry, Chair, if I could. I don't think it's a question of liking or not liking, and it'd be unfortunate if members of the committee would take away a view that either the Treasurer or the Tax Office took the view that some of this was welcome or unwelcome. But the terms of reference for the committee, which the committee has issued, so it's not something that, that the Tax Office asked, but the committee has issued the terms of reference, and it's quite specific about having inquiring the scrutiny arrangements with regard to...
The committee accepted the reference of the terms of reference.
Yeah, sorry, the committee accepted the terms of reference, but I guess the point is, given the terms of reference, I think the ATO has to put on public record what scrutinies are subject to. And it's hard, I think, taking the ones that they have numbered does make the observation to say that the entire cost, and the entire cost is quite significant, both for the Tax Office, but obviously also for people who are making submissions.
It's democracy. It's much cheaper to have a dictatorship.
Well, look...
sorry, Senator. Chair, I wasn't intending to go down to questioning the fundamental institutions of our system of governance. I didn't mean to go that far, so if I did, I apologise.
in relation to the level of scrutiny, I think everybody here agrees that scrutiny is necessary and that it's important that we get outcomes from that scrutiny. Okay, I think we can all agree on that. The issue that arises from my perspective is that we need to ensure that the scrutiny is maintained given the size of the ATO and its power that it has in the community compared to any other agency of government. And the ATO has extraordinary responsibilities and powers, right? And I firmly believe that that should be taken very seriously, and accordingly the scrutiny should be taken very seriously. And if the end result of that is that the ATO is subject to a higher level of scrutiny than any other government department, I think that's perfectly legitimate and perfectly reasonable to ensure that that occurs. Now, we saw in the tax disputes inquiry, there's always two sides to every story, I accept that, right? But we did see in the tax disputes inquiry, and anecdotally we get plenty of other stories of issues that people have with the tax office, whether they be right or wrong at the end of the day, right? And that now that process is taken up by the Inspector General of Taxation as a complaints function. And I think, given the power of the ATO, and unfortunately the public perception of the ATO, they'd rather have, some people would rather have their teeth pulled than deal with the ATO, and we need that external scrutiny to ensure that the public view of the administration of our tax system is fair and equitable. And in the scheme of relative power imbalance, the ATO has enormous power compared to individual taxpayers. Absolutely. And it's incumbent on this committee, and I take the responsibility very seriously on this committee as the chair, as the members of the committee. We've all been at the receiving end of stories from constituents or others in the community. Yes, there are, or there have been over the years, a lot of inquiries and reports into the activities of the ATO. I accept that, and I accept what you've put in there. Some of those you've listed, I suspect, are self-created ones in terms of the external reviews that were conducted, so the external expert reviews. So they weren't, and I'll happy to be corrected, but I would assume that they were reviews that were initiated by the ATO itself, not by the ANAO or somebody in government. But it goes back to where we were discussing issues earlier, and that is that what is the flow of information? And I find very frequently that issues occur when there's a breakdown in the flow of communication between participants in the process. Right? So it goes back to my earlier comment. If over the course of 6 or 7 years you've had 5 reviews into the same issue, why is that occurring? Right? You guys are at the coalface of this because you're on the receiving end of those reviews. My question to you is, what is not occurring in the system and the process of these reviews and responding to the recommendations that you finish up in the space of 6 or 7 years with 5 reviews on the same topic? Because to me, that doesn't make any sense. Right? It might be something that pops up every 5 or 6 years as an issue, that you do a review every 5 or 6 years. But to my way of thinking, to have the same item reviewed 5 times in a 6 or 7 year period is overkill. However, there must be a reason for those people doing those reviews in the first place. So what is breaking down in the system that's occurring? Now, I know on this committee and in the discussions I have with the Secretariat, if we are looking at a particular inquiry topic, one of the first things we'll do is say, who else has done an inquiry on this particular issue and when? Now, if it's 5 or 6 years ago and that issue comes up again, then I'm likely to proceed with an inquiry. I'll have a look at what the previous inquiry did and what their recommendations were. But if there was one done last year, it's highly likely that I'm going to proceed with an inquiry in this committee because it's a waste of your time, this committee's time, and everybody else's time involved. So there must be some fundamental flaw in the system or breakdown in the communication between the participants in those inquiries and the ATO that results in continuous inquiries on the same topic for over a number of years.
So if I could replay the first part of your comments and say the same words, I actually think we're trying to say exactly the same thing. What we tried to paint in our submission is not a picture of an agency trying to escape scrutiny. We're trying to put a context around it, which is we work in a frame of government, which we fully accept, and the Parliament makes decisions about what inquiries it runs. And we get invited to take part, and sometimes we put a hand up to be involved, and other times we don't. What we tried to show through the submission is there is a very large volume of transactions, and given that a lot of it goes through my area, I can guarantee you that we don't get it right all the time. But I hope we get it right fundamentally the majority of the time, in fact the great majority of the time. Our own systems and processes capture about 25,000 complaints a year, which we deal with. The Inspector General at the current time, I think, has logged about 800 or so complaints for this financial year. So we stand in the front position and try and deal with these things in any event, and people are unhappy then go through to the next level. The governance we've talked about, the reviews we've talked about, again, is meant to be evidence to the committee that we don't wait just for external scrutiny. We are actively trying to improve the organisation. And as the Commissioner has said to this committee on many occasions, our objective, our ambition is to make dealing with the tax office as painless as possible. And he would have laughed if he was sitting here when he talked about going to the dentist, because that's just the story he tells. We're not there yet. We are substantially along the road, but we're not there yet. To go to your last point, with the ANAO, they have certain risk models which they put over activities of agencies, and they tend to throw up areas of attention. I'm not aware in my recent history, I've been here 3.5 years, many ANAO, either financial statement or performance audits that have thrown up red button issues, what I'd call. Our financial statements have largely been either clean or what are called category B or C level findings, nothing which is kind of catastrophic. So mostly our financial statements performance has been quite clean. I did say before, the ANAO engages with us around their audit program, and we would go back and say, well, that one was done 2 years ago, but at the end of the day, both the Auditor General and the Inspector General are statutory officers with the right to determine their own work programs.
Can I just jump in there?
Certainly.
In that response to that question from the ANAO about their work program, if it was done 2 years ago, would you, in your response, document the recommendations and the actions you've taken as a result of those recommendations from that prior review?
Yes,
or,
in fact,
or is the expectation that the ANAO go back and look?
Oh, no. Once we come out of review, either an ANAO review, an Ombudsman review or an Inspector General review, recommendations which are accepted and agreed by us go onto the work program, and they become part of the work program of our audit committee. So those will be routinely reported on. If things are either late, that is, we're not getting to the actions as quickly as we said we would, we have reporting systems that would draw attention to that. The ANAO is in the committee for those conversations, so they can see how we're travelling. You may want to direct that question to them about why they might make a decision to audit something which they've seen has had some other scrutiny in the last couple of years.
No, that's not the way it works. The Australian Auditor General is responsible to the Joint Standing Committee on accounts and audit. I was a member of that committee when we brought in that relationship where we were concerned that if government was funding the audit office
that the Audit Office could be limited in its function because the government could cut its budget. And for that reason, it was decided that the Parliament should be the correct body for that budget to be set. And I have sat on meetings when they have put forward the costing of their audit program, and they are going about their statutory duties. Every now and again, we've had great movements from various agencies saying, oh, we don't need the Auditor General, we could have a private sector auditor. I have fought that tooth and nail, along with others, because the function of the Auditor General and the function of a private sector auditor is totally different. So, to say that you've had 51 audits and overviews and so on, with 366 recommendations, I would very much like you to let the committee know, not now, how many of those 366 recommendations were agreed to, and how many of them have been implemented, and how long it took you to implement them. And that doesn't even go to other recommendations that other committees have made that have impinged on the tax office itself. That's just the simple auditory function.
We can take the detail on notice, but I can say to you that of those 366 recommendations, 3/4 of them related to Inspector General reviews.
No, you said 53% were
No,
audit officers.
53% of the audits were conducted by the ANAO. 80% of the recommendations arose from reviews conducted by the Inspector General.
Well, that to my mind says that there is doubly important that the Inspector General is part of the reviewing process, because he is the person to whom individuals can have access when they've got complaints to make. So you can let us know, not now, but let us know in due course, how many have been implemented, how many accepted, how many implemented, and how long it took to implement them, and how many are outstanding.
Well, once they're accepted, we are responsible for implementing them, and as I mentioned to the Chair a moment ago, that's under the attention of our Audit Committee. I think from memory we have over 200 findings on hand at the moment, and we're just working through the process.
Now. Let's just make it accurate and just let us have it when you're ready, when you've got it together. I mean, I'm just looking at page 41 now, effective and efficient scrutiny. And if that's not a directive, I don't know one. And it is not the province and function of the ATO to be giving such a directive.
Sorry, was that paragraph 41, Mrs Bishop? Is that
No, it's page 41 and it's
page 14 of your submission.
Yeah, sorry.
Oh,
It's
okay.
dot point 83, 84, 85 and 86. But anyway,
Not directives, there's suggestions as to what might be an appropriate framework to establish scrutiny or good scrutiny is, but that's always a matter for the Parliament to determine. There's just suggestions as to what the right framework might be. They're not directions. If I may just finish off an aspect of the question you're asking, Chair, in relation to why the same question may get asked. It's usually a function of the scope of a particular review. So if I can just talk about the one that was mentioned before, the review around employer obligations. The issue of director penalty notices came up in quite a number of different reviews and will be examined again in the context of this review. So, for example, in 2015 it came up in the context of the promoting compliance with superobligation guarantee obligations by the ANAO. And again in 2015 the Inspector General looked at it in the context of a review on debt collection. In 2014 the Inspector General looked at it in the context of the ATO's administration of penalties, and again looked at it in the context of the implementation of some other reports or recommendations and further reports between 2009 and 2010. The ANAO again looked at it back in 2013 in the context of the management of debt relief arrangements, and again in 2012 in the engagement of external debt collection agencies.
it sounds to me like they weren't satisfied with what you did.
Well, my point is that the scope of the reviews, although they're ostensibly on other topics, the scope will intend to impinge upon often similar areas if they're not managed appropriately.
Then you should have the material ready and at hand. It should be no trouble at all.
Chair,
Well,
Chair, we would say on the record that the processes that leads to the Inspector General deciding to inquire into something are not transparent to us. So that's why we're struggling to answer the question. The Inspector General quite appropriately has his or her own powers to decide where to inquire in things, and they receive information, advice, complaints, feedback from people. We aren't always privy to the information that's caused them to inquire into a particular area, which is why I guess we may appear to be struggling to answer this particular question. That is not a process that we're necessarily involved in. So we wouldn't be able to assist you in determining how those things get onto the work program.
We don't want to know that, do we?
well, I am interested to know because I find the duplication of the same thing being, I think it was over a period of 5 years there, 5 or 6 years that the same thing came up 5 or 6 times.
But did it? Or does that mean it wasn't dealt with properly the first time? I mean,
Well,
the
we
Australian
have
Audit
we
Office
we
is
have
a highly
no.
competent group of people, and they don't muck about.
Well, we're going to be speaking to them in due course, so we can re-ask that question of them to understand that process better. But from the ATO's perspective, who we have here today, do you have any idea of the information that you provided, that those various inquiries, how different that was each time, or was it similar? And were there specific recommendations from early on, from say the first time there was a review on it or an inquiry into it, to the last time where recommendations weren't acted on or weren't dealt with that resulted in it being raised in subsequent inquiries?
I'm happy to get that for the committee.
If I can give you an example of my own experience, that when I sat on the Joint Standing Committee of Public Accounts and Audit, having a particular issue dealing with the relationship between the Australian Tax Office and ATSIC with regard to companies being struck off and whether or not superannuation could be collected, brought it up at a public hearing. Oh yes, we'll look into that, we'll do it. 6 months later they came back, where's the answer? Oh, we haven't done it. You bet we asked the question again and got into it again. I can cite many examples along those lines over the time. Now, that's not to say that I don't have respect for the work that the Tax Office does. I do. And people within the Tax Office who have their commitment to fulfilling their duties, not only to the best of their ability, but competently and carrying out the business they're supposed to carry out. But the system of scrutiny that exists in this place, as I said right at the beginning, you're the biggest organisation, you affect everybody's life. Lots of people don't like what is done with the money you collect. If they're buying shares and they didn't like what the board of directors are doing, they can sell the shares and go put the money somewhere else. But you take it compulsorily. They have no say what you do with it and what the government does with it. So they feel aggrieved. So the point is that you are going to be scrutinised more than anybody else because you've got a tentacle into everybody's life.
Chair, if I may just comment on a question you posed earlier about what's sort of not happening in the system so that you get this duplication. I think part of the challenge here is that the different approaches that the scrutiny is used. So with the ANAO, Mr Loop has laid out their approach. With the Inspector General, it's a slightly different approach. We don't have the visibility perhaps as to the drivers behind why a particular area is reviewed. There isn't as much communication and transparency around that.
So can you give me an example of the difference in it, of how the ANAO would approach it as compared to the Inspector General of Taxation?
Well, I guess to start with, the Inspector General, unlike the ANAO, calls for submissions on areas that people would like, the public would like the Inspector General to inquire into. that immediately is going to give rise to people who have a complaint, an axe to grind about something, and won't necessarily, and that's fine because those things should be brought forward. Don't get me wrong, but it's whether or not that then it represents a systemic and whole of ATO and for that matter whole of government approach to a particular issue, I guess is unclear to us. Whereas we know the ANAO takes a more systemic whole of government and whole of ATO approach. So a series of anecdotes.
The difference is too is that the ANAO isn't dealing. The ANAO has a different set of responsibilities. Clearly.
Sure.
Because it's about administration. And
that's right, but the types of inquiries that the Inspector General is doing does go to our administration of certain parts of our operations. So to that extent they do overlap, at least in terms of what they may inquire into, and I guess the way in which they go about forming their program is quite different. An auditor would take the approach to work out whether or not the noise that they're hearing in relation to something is in fact anecdotal versus systemic, and make some inquiries to work out whether or not it passes a systemic test first before they go further. We don't know whether the Inspector General takes that approach or not. It's not clear to us, so we just don't have that level of visibility. He rightly would say that he needs to ensure that the people who come to him have a level of anonymity, as you know, to us, absolutely fair. But we don't see necessarily that the appropriate filter is then run over it to work out whether or not these issues are necessarily systemic as opposed to a series of anecdotes.
Yeah, but can I explain to you, having sat on the committee that made the recommendation, it was because the Ombudsman function and the way it functions in government means very often that the ordinary punter doesn't get a fair go, because the staff that comes in to do the investigation with the Ombudsman comes out of the department where the complaint has been made. And people, by and large, don't recognise that. They're seconded into him to do the work. The whole point about the Inspector General is he's on the side of the taxpayer. He's got to take the concern, the complaint, and the reason that we wanted him there was because he's independent of you. And if he makes your life difficult, that's tough. That's his job, because he's on the side of the taxpayer to get things right for them. Now, he has limitations on what he can do as well, as you know and I know. And I've known of examples where people have gone to the Inspector General in years gone by and they've taken up a particular issue and he hasn't been able to get anywhere with it. And then it'll become a more political process. But the Inspector General is very important to it, and it went, the whole philosophy of it went together with the need for the charter, taxpayers' charter, because the taxpayer felt it was David and Goliath, and he was Goliath, and you were the big boy, and they were just the little boy. So the whole purpose of it was to give the ordinary punter a go, because they felt oppressed. And that all came out in that evidence back in 1991. And I think it's been a good move. But the Auditor General's function is totally and utterly different, as you well know. He does performance audits and he does regulatory audits. Make sure nobody's had their hand in the till and everything's going along quite well. But the performance audits are for a specific purpose, as you well know, and allows him to delve more deeply. Now, he's the guardian. He's the guardian. He's the linchpin between us and the Parliament and the agencies. And they perform a most important function. And I think in one way they are almost one of the most important parts of our whole democratic process, because they really do have the opportunity, except, as you know, where there's a corporation, where the I think is of the board of directors, the majority have been appointed by the Minister for Finance, and he can't go in of his own volition, which I also think ought to be removed, but that's another question. But I will always go to bat for the Auditor General, always. And the program that he works out with the Joint Standing Committee of Public Accounts and Audits is done with appropriate
attention to the amount of money he has and the degree of the depth of the particular inquiry he has to do. All of that has to be managed in terms of his having the resources to do it. Now, you're a much bigger agency, you've got your own resources, you've got to balance them too. But I'm sorry, it's like the rest of us. We all get beaten up from time to time. We have to get on with it.
I can't disagree with anything you've just said, Mrs. Bishop. Those agencies do fulfil important roles, the AO in particular. And when they do a performance audit, with the greatest respect, there is not an enormous difference between the performance audit and the type of review that the Inspector General undertakes. They cover very, very much the same types of things in the same types of ways.
But they're answerable to different masters. One is the government, that's their job, that's their regulatory function by legislation. The other is to look after the taxpayer. Two different responsibilities.
But I think we would say, Mrs. Bishop, that in pursuing issues on behalf of individual taxpayers, which is the complaints function, completely understand it with the Inspector General. What we're saying is that we don't think that there's enough transparency in how something moves from being a complaint to being the source of a systemic review, and we're not involved in that discussion. That's a matter for the Inspector General.
But the Inspector General of Taxation was doing systemic reviews before they got the complaints function.
That's right.
Yes, that's right.
And they were set up to do it.
But they were getting them off the back of individual complaints when they called for submissions. And that's where we started this part of the conversation, was around what's the difference between them. And the difference is in the way in which they initiate their reviews.
Because they are answerable to different callings.
And with the greatest respect again, Mrs. Bishop, the Inspector General may be on the side of the taxpayer, but that doesn't mean we are not.
Well,
we are certainly trying to ensure that we...
I think you buy an argument.
Could I just...
but that's
I know
part of the role that we've been trying to change ever since Commissioner Jordan started.
I know, and there's been big improvements, and I'm not for the moment debating it, but for you to hope that the taxpayer is going to think of you as warm and cuddly, you've got a long way to go.
We don't expect that.
We don't expect it's going to happen tomorrow.
Or ever.
That may well be true, and as also fairly recent newcomer to the tax office, and having had different views as an external person to an internal person, I can say that one of the things that I do think we should put on the record is, and Mr. Lipa did mention in his opening comments, is the organisation has changed quite dramatically, I think, would be agreed upon by the committee members and external organisations and the community as well. Since Mr. Jordan became the Commissioner, we have become more open, more transparent. We are putting our clients at the centre of everything we do. And that is
any of the clients
reflected.
getting a surname when they ring up and make an inquiry, or is it still Julie, Pat and Fred?
No, we do
surnames
reveal.
now?
I mean, we do give our names. In fact, actually, that's
surnames.
part of our, well, I'm not so sure about the surnames.
No, there's no surnames.
First names.
First names only.
First names. But what I wanted to say is there are other differences. I mean, I had started down the path of how the reviews actually are planned. But the other thing to mention about the Inspector General and the approach that's taken there is that it is a progress, not an annual program of review. It can be 18 months in the making, and sometimes reviews go over a much longer period than that. And certainly if you take into account also the implementation of recommendations, this can go on for quite some time, the review process.
But that comes back to my earlier comment about communication.
Absolutely, but the point that I wanted to make is that for us in the organisation, we are dynamic, we're moving all the time, we're becoming a really contemporary leading tax and super administration.
Next you'll tell me you're agile.
And we are agile as well, Ms Bishop. I'd like to think so.
We've just missed innovative.
As much as 18,000 people can be agile, we try to be agile, yes.
But the point being...
We try to be.
Actually, you're not supposed to be too innovative. You're supposed to be black letter lawyers.
No, we're supposed to apply the law as Parliament intended.
By the time...
And that's what
black letter law.
Well, that's not through black letter, but anyway, we try to follow Parliament's intent.
By the time we get the recommendations coming through, we're already aware of some of the issues. We've already got work in train to address the issues. And in fact, we are now taking a slightly different stance with the Inspector General when we come to this agreeing or disagreeing with recommendations, which in the past we tended to always agree or disagree, and there was no middle ground. But now what we are doing, and this is part of the communication and the relationship with the Inspector General, is actually saying, well, no, we actually have that in train, we've got that covered, because very often we do have that covered. So that is another part of the difference, not only in the way in which these reviews are planned for, but also the approach that we are taking. So when you ask about how many do we agree to, disagree to, I think you'll find as we go forward there's a completely different approach to that to reflect the new organisation and how we are actually putting the client at the centre. The other thing is that the recommendations, if you look at the number of recommendations that come through from the Inspector General, in comparison to any of the other scrutineers, it does seem... Well, may I just finish? Because I think it does go to the point about the efficiency and effectiveness of the reviews, okay? We find that many of the recommendations that are made add little value, and I don't mean that in a... No, I would like to explain that. Some of these are administrative in nature and have very little impact on improving the client experience.
I'll wait till I see the response that
some
you
of
send
them,
in. That'll
and
be
I
fine.
can give you some examples, are very costly and do not actually impact on the experience for the client or shift the experience. Now, those resources could well be put into...
But in fairness to the Inspector General of Taxation, right, he's providing you a set of recommendations. Now, it's my understanding, you're not obligated to take those recommendations on board, right?
I think it would be fair to say, Chair, there has been an expectation that we would agree to a great majority. In the 5 years since July 2010, there have been 293 separate Inspector General recommendations, which we've agreed to 234 of those. That's 80%.
That's terrific, but what I want to know is if you've implemented them.
Well, many of them we would argue, Mrs Bishop, that we were in fact in the process of implementing them.
Well, I don't mind about that. I just want to know, are they implemented?
And I can, if I may just clarify what I said 10 minutes ago about scrutiny recommendations. We closed out 78 scrutiny recommendations in 2015. As at the end of the year, there were still 67 open. I said 267. I apologise, it was 67. We keep track of all those things. What Ms Curtis is saying, what the organisation is saying to the Inspector General is we need to be more careful about saying we agree with something if in fact we believe we are already doing it.
Well, you can say that.
We haven't been as robust as we might have been in saying, well, that's something that needs change.
What this is developing into is you versus the Inspector General. And I'm sticking up for the Inspector General because he's on the taxpayer's side. Now, that's the way it is.
And we won't oppose for opposition's sake. We will say, we will be more clear with the Inspector General and say, if there's a recommendation made, and we would have indicated this through the course of the review, we say, but we're already working on that. We would say it's already under preparation.
You would say that ordinarily when the Auditor General comes to you. If he says this and you say, oh, we're already working on that, you know as well as I do that when you get the Auditor General's report, you're allowed to have input on it before it's published.
Certainly.
And presumably you do the same with the Inspector General.
We get to provide a letter at the end of the report, yes. We get to provide comment on the draft, which may or may not be accepted, and we could provide a letter at the end.
So if you're already doing something, you'll express that.
But the body of the report indicates agreement in principle or disagreement as you go through each recommendation.
Indeed it does, but you know also that it has a body, it has a little paragraph above it before you comment on the recommendation. All I want to know is number recommended,
and we'll provide
agreed to, and whether they've been implemented.
Yep, we'll provide
and
that.
how many are outstanding.
Yep.
I think it's important, goes back to my earlier comment, the scrutiny remains, right? As we see with any number of reports to government, it's not axiomatic because there's a recommendation in a report that's automatically implemented, right? And I would expect that the ATO, in its professional capacity, has the capacity to sit down with one of its scrutineers who's produced a report with a set of recommendations, and if it is concerned about a recommendation or a number of recommendations, it has the capacity to sit down with that person and discuss those recommendations and why they will not work. or be costly to implement that may outweigh the cost of what potentially would be recovered or the problem that would be solved.
And that's what every other agency does.
And it appears to me from the discussion that we're having tonight that part of the equation, communication, actually sitting down with the scrutineers and talking about the recommendations in their various reports that you may have concerns over, or that you identify inefficiencies in it being able to implement that actually make the administration more difficult, or it adds cost unnecessarily to the administration of the taxation system, that those discussions are not being had. And my suggestion at this point is that maybe that's the first place to start looking, is to improve the levels of communication and be prepared to have those discussions with those organisations, rather than saying we have too much scrutiny. That would, to me, be part of improving the efficiency of the outcomes of the scrutiny that presently occurs, and it may, in the long term, result in situations such as we've discussed about directors' penalty notices being addressed in 5 or 6 separate reviews over 5 or 6 years, not occurring because those lines of communication are much more open and much more transparent across those organisations.
So,
right? But you know, from this committee's perspective, and there's further hearings to go, obviously a number of other submissions, but certainly as Ms Bishop has pointed out, and certainly from my perspective as chair of this committee over the past couple of years, and I'm on the public record as saying it, I think the ATO is doing a good job, is working diligently to improve its systems and processes. So I'm not taking that away in any regard.
I think it's something we're delighted to see.
And I think it's a terrific outcome.
If I could briefly respond. Whilst we have a preference for less scrutiny, but only on the basis that we would have
Well, I'm sorry to disappoint you, but it's not going away.
But on the basis that we would have earned that through our performance, but we do understand and we accept that the tax system is something that affects every Australian. If you accepted the proposition, and we certainly do, that we're not able to determine how much scrutiny we're under, that's
correct.
Completely appropriately the decisions of Parliament and the statutory agencies they've established. Our submission was directed towards the 2 terms of reference that the committee has accepted, particularly 1 and 2. That is, how can we make that scrutiny more effective by removing inefficiency and duplication, which is where we've directed a substantial part of our submission to, and how might we reduce the cost to government? I think the Chair, you've offered a perspective there about we need to perhaps communicate more and be more robust about which ones we take on and say we'll implement.
On both accounts.
But we've directed our submission fundamentally against those 2 things, saying to this committee that we expect to be measured on our performance. We would hope to be measured on the degree of earned autonomy we have, accepting that we're never going to get out of the corral for nothing. And what we're suggesting is, you know, were people to say, well, bad luck, ATO, you're going to continue to get the same amount of scrutiny, what we've tried to say in our submission is, well, how do we make that more effective and forward-facing and scrutiny that actually improves the taxpayer experience, because that's what our strategy is, to improve the taxpayer experience.
Expressions like taxpayer experience, I mean, really.
Look, I've got no concerns at all, Mr Leap, with your statement. That's exactly what I was going to. And I think the example we've used tonight with directors' penalty notices and 5 inquiries in 7 years is a classic case in point where we can improve efficiencies, reduce duplication. But as I've said, I think a lot of that comes out of communication and improving 2-way communication between the various agencies. So I think we're all in fierce agreement on that, and
Can I just add one thing to what Mr Leaper said, and going to your point, Chair, about communication. There have been occasions in the past where we have been given drafts of reports and recommendations and so on, and have sat down and tried to point out where modifications and improvements could be made to those where they suffer the kinds of flaws that you've referred to. In some cases that has been ignored, and the final report comes out still anyway. So I just want to make sure that the committee doesn't go away with the impression that we don't try to engage on that basis already, at least to some extent.
Any other questions?
No, I would expect that to be the case because that's the way the system works. They come to you with a draft and then they talk to you about it, and changes will be made in some areas and not in other areas, and then out comes the report.
Or just ignored altogether. Anyway.
Well, thank you everybody for coming along today. Are there any final comments you wish to make?
I was concerned in the first 15 to 20 minutes. I think we've approached something which is more, because where we finished, I think, is where we had intended our submission to be placed. Scrutiny for the ATO is inevitable because we operate on such a large scale, and there is always going to be a degree of noise. What we're hoping to achieve from a review, if you're asking what we're looking for, it's not that there not be scrutiny. We understand that's going to happen. It's how do we get the scrutiny to be the most effective. And with great respect to the Inspector General, we would say that the ANAO scrutiny is much more effective because there is more dialogue and two-way conversation. We haven't had that lived experience in recent time with the Inspector General, as Mr Mills has pointed out. That's something we'll take some responsibility for working on as well. But our objective here is to make sure that scrutiny improves the performance of the office and provides assurance back to bodies such as this committee and to the Parliament. That's where we're coming from.
Right, well, I think I just want to say again that Inspector General was put there for good purpose.
Yes.
And I have no intention of abandoning him. He has a very important function to perform. As you do.
Thank you.
Well, again, thank you everybody, and on behalf of the committee, I'd like to thank everybody for the evidence today. I'd also like to thank Hansard and Broadcasting for their assistance. Now, we did have some questions on notice. If we could, I'd require those be provided to the Secretariat by Friday the 8th of April 2016, and I declare this public hearing closed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.